I have spent decades at the bedside of people taking their final breaths, and if there is one thing I've learned, it's that the human body doesn't always follow the rules written in medical textbooks. You see things that shouldn't be possible, patients whose organs have completely shut down, yet they remain perfectly stable, almost as if they are anchored to this world by an invisible thread. It's a strange, heavy stillness that feels less like a biological failure and more like a deliberate pause, a moment where the clock stops ticking, but the heart refuses to let go. I remember one afternoon in a quiet hospice room where a family sat huddled together, eyes fixed on a man who hadn't spoken in days. His breathing was shallow and labored, that rhythmic, heavy sound that usually signals the very end is only minutes away. But he stayed in that state for hours, then for a full day, as if he were suspended in time. We all knew why. They were waiting for his youngest son, who was still miles away on a plane, and the tension in that room was so thick you could almost feel the patient holding his breath, waiting for a specific key to turn in a lock. The second that son stepped through the door and whispered, "I'm here, Dad," the entire energy in the room shifted in a way that science simply can't measure. There was no grand speech, just a tiny, almost imperceptible squeeze of the hand, and within moments, that heavy, struggling breath smoothed out into a soft sigh and then simply stopped. Most people look at a scene like that and call it a coincidence or a final fight for life. But after seeing this happen dozens of times, I realized it's something much more profound. It isn't a struggle at all. It's a quiet process of waiting for permission to let go. And once you see the signs, it changes everything you thought you knew about the end. In that room, the family looked at me with eyes full of a frantic, unspoken question, wondering why his heart kept beating when the monitors suggested it should have stopped hours ago. They saw a struggle, a painful tug-of-war between a failing body and a stubborn spirit. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Was this just a glitch in biology, or was something much more deliberate happening? Most people think it's just the body failing, but the reality is far more mysterious. To the untrained eye, it looked like he was trapped in a state of suffering, caught in a loop of shallow breaths that led nowhere. I watched the daughter lean in, her voice trembling with the fear that this delay was a sign of hidden agony. But I noticed something they didn't, a specific, calm stillness in his hands that contradicted the labor of his chest. He wasn't fighting. It was as if he were guarding a secret, waiting for a very specific key to turn. When the son finally arrived and touched his father's hand, the atmosphere didn't just change, it dissolved. It was as if a long-held note had finally found its resolution. The family called it a beautiful coincidence, a lucky break in the timing of a tragedy. But I knew better than to dismiss it. Why does the body wait when the brain is supposedly gone? There is a hidden language in these final hours that most of us are completely deaf to, and it's time we heard it. The monitors tell one story, a heart rate that should be erratic and oxygen levels that should be plummeting, but the patient's body often tells another. It's a state of suspended animation that defies every clinical prediction I've ever made in my career. I've seen patients whose kidneys have completely failed and whose lungs are barely moving, yet they remain in this bizarrely stable plateau for days on end. It isn't the frantic, messy struggle for life you see in movies. It's a heavy, focused silence, like a runner who has finished the race but refuses to sit down until they see a specific face in the crowd. In these moments, the breathing takes on a very specific quality, a shallow, rhythmic huffing that sounds like a clock ticking down, yet the pendulum never quite stops. To a grieving family, this looks like the body is trapped in a loop of exhaustion, a mechanical failure that simply won't resolve itself. They see a loved one who appears gone because they don't respond to their names or open their eyes, yet the skin remains strangely warm and the pulse stays impossibly steady. It is as if the physical machinery is running on a backup battery that shouldn't exist, fueled by an emotional checklist only the patient can see. What is most unsettling is the way the atmosphere in the room thickens, becoming almost magnetic as the hours stretch into days. You might notice a patient's fingers twitching toward the door every time it creaks, or a subtle tension in their jaw that only softens when a certain voice is heard in the hallway, even when they are supposedly comatose. We often use clinical terms like terminal restlessness to describe this, but that feels like a hollow mask for the profound, invisible calculation occurring behind those closed eyelids. There is a final weighing of debts and a quiet guarding of the exit that keeps the heart beating against all medical odds. And that's the part that changes everything. When families sit by the bedside during those long, silent hours, I often see a look of pure, agonizing confusion in their eyes. They hear that heavy, rattling breath or see a slight furrow in the brow and immediately assume their loved one is trapped in a world of pain. It is natural to think that if the body is lingering, it must be fighting a losing battle against a cruel clock. They look at me, pleading for more morphine, convinced that every extra minute is just another moment of hidden agony. But here is where medical charts and human intuition often clash in the most surprising way. What looks like a frantic struggle is frequently something much more orderly and even peaceful beneath the surface. We assume that a body fighting to stay is in distress, but I've learned to see that tension as a form of deep, quiet focus instead. It isn't that something has gone wrong with the dying process. It is actually that the person is completing a very specific internal checklist. The truth is, if they were truly in pain, we would see it in the heart rate or the way their skin reacts. But often, those vitals remain eerily calm. That heavy breathing isn't always a sign of drowning. It's the body's way of shifting into a different gear, one that allows for a final, mysterious pause. Most people are terrified that this delay means the person is afraid to move on. However, what if I told you that this perceived struggle is actually their final act of profound control? To understand what is happening, we have to look past the sounds that scare us. That heavy, rhythmic breathing isn't a sign of someone drowning. It is a specific pattern where the body shifts into an automatic mode, almost like a car idling before being turned off. While it sounds like a struggle to us, it's actually a sign that the physical world is receding. But why does the heart remain so steady? It's because the body is following a hidden map that science rarely discusses. You might notice the skin on their feet or knees beginning to change color, turning a dusky purple. We call this modeling, but it's really just the body turning off the lights in the rooms it no longer needs. It is drawing all its energy inward, focusing everything on the heart for one final task. Even as the hands grow cold, the chest remains strangely warm. It's a physical signal that the person is still present, just in a way we aren't used to seeing. But what is happening behind that silence? This brings us to their consciousness, the most misunderstood part of all. We see someone who doesn't respond and assume they are gone, but they are actually deep in focused work. Think of it like a pilot concentrating during a landing. They can't talk, but they are aware of everything. They are processing a final emotional checklist and listening to every word spoken. This isn't a lapse into nothingness, but a transition that requires all their strength. And that is exactly where the timing starts to make sense. When you look at these signs together, the breathing, the cooling skin, and the internal focus, a clear pattern emerges. It isn't a chaotic breakdown, but a highly organized withdrawal. The body isn't failing, it is simplifying itself to its most essential parts. Every patient follows this path, yet each moves at their own pace, holding on until the internal and external worlds finally align. This is why some people linger for days. They aren't stuck, they are simply waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. I remember a man named Arthur, whose body seemed to defy every rule I had ever learned in nursing school. His monitors showed his heart was barely fluttering, and his kidneys had stopped functioning days before. Yet he remained in a state of perfectly frozen stability. His family sat in a circle of exhausted silence, watching his chest rise and fall with that heavy, rhythmic huffing that usually signals the very end. But Arthur wasn't leaving. It felt like he was anchored to the bed by an invisible, heavy weight. The air in the room was thick with a specific kind of tension, the kind you only feel when a story is missing its final sentence. Everyone knew his youngest son was still on a plane, miles above the clouds, racing against a clock that should have run out hours ago. To the doctors, this was just a biological anomaly, a heart that didn't know how to quit. But to those of us in the room, it felt like Arthur was guarding the door, his jaw set in a quiet, stubborn focus that science simply cannot map. Suddenly, the door creaked open and the son stumbled in, still carrying the cold air of the outside world on his jacket. He didn't say a word. He just reached out and took his father's hand, leaning close to his ear. I watched Arthur's fingers, the ones that had been cold and still for hours, give a tiny, almost invisible squeeze against his son's palm. It wasn't a dramatic Hollywood moment, but the atmosphere in that room didn't just change. It completely dissolved into a profound, sudden lightness. Within 3 minutes of that touch, the heavy, labored breathing that had filled the room for 2 days simply smoothed out into a single, soft sigh. It wasn't a struggle or a collapse, but a graceful exit, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The family whispered about coincidences and luck, but I saw the truth in the way his face finally relaxed. He wasn't fighting to stay. He was simply waiting for the permission to go, proving that the heart hears things the ears can no longer process. We spend so much of our lives fearing the end, imagining it as a chaotic loss of control. But what I've witnessed at the bedside is often the exact opposite. Those long hours of lingering aren't a sign of a body that's broken. They are evidence of a spirit that is still very much in charge of its own departure. When you stop seeing the heavy breathing as a struggle and start seeing it as a patient finishing their final emotional checklist, the fear in the room simply evaporates. It isn't a medical failure. It is a final, profound act of human will. Once you understand that your loved one isn't trapped, but is instead carefully navigating their own exit, every heavy breath feels less like a countdown and more like a sacred, silent conversation. It changes the way we sit in those rooms, turning what looks like a tragedy into a moment of incredible connection and release. If you've ever felt that strange, heavy stillness and wondered if there was something more happening beneath the surface, you were right. We are so much more than just a collection of organs, and the way we wait for permission to leave proves it. In the end, letting go isn't a fall into the dark, but a gentle stepping into a long-awaited peace. If you've ever witnessed a moment where the timing felt like more than a coincidence, please share your experience in the comments so we can continue this journey of understanding together. It turns out that the most beautiful part of life is often the quiet grace of how it concludes.